and sustainable world order, and how attainable is this with the present structure of the United Nations Security Council, one of the multilateral organizations that actually is tasked in solving a global crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's edition of the program. It is Global Insight on For You Media Africa. We are looking at the role of the United Nations Security Council and also dwelling on the reforming of the Council and asking the question of how feasible this is. It should be noted that the call for the practical reforming of the United Nations Security Council actually meets some resistance, and of course in recent times countries have been very vocal calling for the reforming of the United Nations Security Council to meet the present times, and this call is echoed as Sierra Leone assumes the presidency of the month of August. Reforms that will see the adherence of Asian, Latin American and African nations to very prominent positions at the multilateral organization. The call is actually high in the United Nations Security Council stands as the foremost international body charged with maintaining global peace and security. However, the composition of the Council has long been and continues to be a subject of criticism, with calls for reform growing louder. In recent years, countries like Kuwait, Russia, Austria, and many countries across the African continent, among others, have called for the need to reform the Western-dominated United Nations Security Council. Currently, the UNSC comprises 15 member countries, including 5 permanent members, which are Russia, China, the United States, and United Kingdom and France. It should be noted that no permanent representative from Africa and even Asian countries, and top list of Latin American countries, despite especially Africa being a continent of about almost 55 states of the 193 member states of the UN. This glaring imbalance, therefore, not only perpetrate what many have perceived as historical injustice across African countries and others at the United Nations Security Council, but also limits the Council's effectiveness in addressing contemporary global challenges. So therefore we ask this question: how feasible is the transformation of the United Nations Security Council into a more inclusive and more effective institution that will reflect the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just tuning in, you're welcome, and this is a Global Insider with a panel of experts. We're going to get more understanding on what or how the present structure of the United Nations Security Council is, and of course what are those practical reforms that need to be put into place to meet the changes of the 21st century. I will be taking you straight away to Russia, and we're being joined by Julia Berg, a political scientist, also founder Global Expert Club. Hello to you, dear Julia, and thanks for accepting to do this with us this day.
Thank you for the invitation. I think it's a very important topic, and the issue of the UN, generally speaking, as an organization, has been widely discussed for many years by now, so it might feel like the time has come.
Thank you so much, dear Julia, for accepting our rendezvous. And I think we are staying in Russia with Arnold Davley, a political consultant. Thank you for accepting to be our guest for today.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure. And I will echo Julia in saying that this is a very relevant topic. one that has been, as we say in French, a serpent de mer for many years now. But in the wake of the degradation of the international legal order and the international security, takes on more relevance as ever. So, looking forward for a good discussion on the issue.
Thank you so much, Arnaud Davely. To note that Dr. Rashid Pelpo from Ghana will be joining us subsequently. While waiting for him, we're going to go straight away to the contextual framework of the United Nations Security Council. It is imperative, let me right off with you, Arnaud Davely, to understand what the United Nations Security is all about, and about the origin and the structure, the setting, which is becoming problematic in today's world.
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, the Security Council is some would say the executive branch, but I would add executive and legislative, because they get to either adopt binding resolution or reject them, pending on some veto emanating from either one of their permanent members. But as you mentioned, it's a body that essentially is composed of 15 nation states, 5 permanent members and 10 rotating ones. The 5 permanent members on top of it dispose of the right of veto, which basically is the ultimate nuclear option to prevent any kind of draft resolution from being adopted by anyone who's willing to, advance the cause of peace or provide some kind of framework to decrease a crisis, an ongoing crisis, and so on and so forth. Just a few tidbits in terms of statistics. The number of resolutions which basically were adopted by the Security Council from 1990 to the year 2000 basically exceeded the amount in 10 years of resolution adopted from 1945 to 1989. So one could say that owing to the Cold War, there was a lot of veto, obviously, exchanged back and forth, especially between the late Soviet Union, the Russian Federation being a successor state, but then the Soviet Union, and on one hand, and China, the Popular Republic of China, and what was then known as the NATO, and still today the NATO countries. And so basically there was a deadlock, an institutional deadlock, very pronounced one, for the first 4 decades of the institution. And then once the Cold War somehow faded away, we saw a profusion of resolution adopted, which tend to show that this was more of an expression of a unipolar moment, and that as such, it's not as much that multilateralism was put front and center, but that one hegemon, the United States, basically sucked all the oxygen out of the room and was able, owing to its geopolitical weight, to impose, and through either coercion or through bribes, certain resolutions, which make no mistake about it, in the word, in their drafting and in their design, were aimed at promoting and consolidating their status as an hegemon. So we've seen more of a return to form, I wouldn't say back to the days of the Cold War, but somewhat more of an opposition, I would say, starting from the 2010s, with the resurgence of Russia, the Russian Federation, as it were, as a world player, able to project power on the international level once more, and as such, using its institutional levers at the Security Council to cancel out any kind of resolution deemed a threat to the stability of the international order, especially as far as the Syrian crisis is concerned. The Russian Federation vetoed a lot of resolution which might have called for the use of force against that country, for instance. Okay. Something which obviously it learned the hard way back in the early 2010s, when in the context of the Libyan crisis, which we remember there were two resolutions, 1970 and 1973, which were at the time adopted by the Security Council in the context of the Chapter 7 legal regime. Yeah. And the Russian Federation at the time had not vetoed, but abstained. And by abstaining, this allowed the resolution to be adopted. But as we saw later on, the language was somehow left somewhat vague, and that allowed NATO to conduct itself in Libya in a way so as to effect regime change, when in fact they were supposed to, play a role as an interpositional force between the government of Muammar Gaddafi and the rebels. So as we saw, you have to be very careful about the Security Council and don't trust what the other party said necessarily. And now we systematically, as soon as we have an ambiguous element to a resolution in the drafting, the Libyan precedent comes into play, and obviously now we have more of a deadlock again on many issues.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry if I was a little long, yes.
All right, thank you, Arnaud Davali, for the holistic approach to the contextual framework of the United Nations Security Council. In the same light with you, dear Yulia, what do you think, from, of course, what Arnaud Davali has underlined, what do you think are the primary motivations behind the current call for the UN Security Council reform, particularly in relation to historical context and the contemporary challenges, and how feasible is it given the power dynamics existing between the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council?
Well, at the moment, we see that the current members of the UN Security Council do not really reflect the balance of force at the international arena, and that seems to be the main problem around it, right? Actually, one of the main problems around it. Just like Arnaud mentioned, unfortunately, the architecture of international relations that was introduced after the World War II in order to maintain a certain status quo that would allow countries to cooperate rather than to compete, especially using violence and military force. That architecture has failed, or it was intentionally put aside, let's say, when the rules of the game, the actual realistic rules of the game, were quite far from the institutional design and from the legal design that was once introduced and agreed upon by all of the key players of the global arena. So we see that problem number one is that among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, we do not really see some of the powerful states that definitely, by all of the possible criteria, deserve to be there, right? That's number one. Number two is that there is quite a lot of rotation among the non-permanent members, which also does not really allow for, let's say, stable and regular lobbying for regional interests, at least, right? So we do understand that the UN Security Council cannot and probably should not include all of the countries, but at least the key players should be presented there in order to be able to voice their opinion. That's number one. And in order to exercise the veto rule, which also plays one of the key roles. So the way the Security Council was was operating for many decades was based on the fact that we were living in kind of like a bipolar system where on the one side there were the United States of America, and on the other side the USSR. And so in order to be able to resolve the conflict through negotiations rather than using military force or conducting military operations, the veto rule meant that if either one of the global powers does not agree with a certain policy or with a certain let's say proposal, then there is an opportunity to put it through negotiation process. But then what we saw happening was that those rules were ignored, and many of the military activities carried out and military operations by NATO and led by the United States were conducted without confirmation, in some cases without even an explicit discussion at the UN Security Council. So that lays the foundations for the crisis that we have been observing for several years by now. And for example, talking about the African continent, the South Africa, the Republic of South Africa has been, let's say, a candidate to be a permanent member of the Security Council for quite a while, as it was also matching all of the key criteria, and it was ready to take up the role of the permanent representative of the continent. Yet we see that the situation changes each year, right? And we have a lot of countries that have grown in terms of their peacekeeping potential, in terms of their economic potential, and many other things. Yet the, let's say, the members of the Security Council and the overall design of the body still remains the same.
Okay. Thank you. Talking about Africa, I think it's time for us to welcome Dr. Rashid Pelbo, President, African Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development. Of course, sir, we'll be welcoming you with this question. On the 12th of August 2024, the African position at the United Nations Security Council will be actually on the table of discussion, as Sierra Leone is leading the presidency of the Security Council this month. What is your holistic analysis pertaining the call which has been ongoing for years, pertaining the place of the African continent in the or at the United Nations Security Council?
Well, thank you so much, and I send my greetings to my colleagues who are contributing very meaningfully to this program. The UN Security Council has been a subject of discussion by many on the basis that it does appear unfair and non-democratic to the overall interest of the members, the 193 members of the United Nations. And so there's a huge expectation that some reform has to happen, to create a situation where the United Nations Security Council represents the broader majority of people than the fewer number of people and the large and extreme powers they have in dealing with issues that concern all people. So I think that the position of Africa is to support the reform process and to insist that it's not just about the size of the nation, the strategic interest of the nation, but also the geographical location of the states is important. The interest of the people, even those who do not have the capacity to mobilize resources and to develop arms, also need to be represented, because we want to see a fair representation of all opinions in the Security Council. And we know that the need for the Security Council is emphasized on the fact that we want to create world peace and want to ensure that consistently we do not have divergent interests which are unaddressed and which can bring about conflicts beyond limits of control. Yeah. So I think that Africa's position is very crucial. It's very, very necessary that we increase the United Nations participation, the United Nations number and involvement, and include Africa as well, because it's going to take consideration of the perspectives we bring into the world, the dangers we suffer in terms of how much we can protect ourselves, the fact that we are sovereign states and have our own perspective about life should also be considered. The fact that we need a total number of about 129 nations to vote to accept this. We believe that the non-veto use, the non-veto should be applied in the selection or in the choice of ensuring that this Security Council is reformed. Security Council is necessary because the whole concept of the United Nations is to create peace, is to create balance, is to ensure that nations are heard, and is to ensure that there is the security of every nation, including the weak ones, are protected, and that the rights of people are also protected. The sovereignty of nations are upheld. And so it's a necessity that if you have these concepts to define the whole idea of the United Nations, each Security Council must not be over-empowered to the extent that only a few, as 5 countries, can take decisions for everybody. So it's essential that much more is discussed on this, and a fundamental reason exists for them, for us all to reform this council, to give vent to its performance, and to provide equal participation. At least regional participation is necessary. And if you are considering members, you can leave out a whole continent of more than 1 billion people out of the equation. Absolutely. It means that in a situation where there is real challenge facing Africa, somebody else has to stop for Africa, not us, Africa itself, especially where there is a veto power coming to offset any decisions that are a need for us to enjoy our peace and security in our continent.
Indeed, needed the need for us to enjoy peace and security and even stability across the African continent. Subsequently, Dr. Rashid, we are going to look at the effect of the limited or under-representation of the African continent in the United Nations Security Council. But before then, let's continue with Arnold Davley. We have highlighted the need for reforms and also highlighted some of the countries that have been very vocal in the past years, and even in present, the moment for these reforms to be effected at the United Nations Security Council. Can you, and in your capacity as a political consultant, outline some of these reform proposals which are currently being looked at as to being feasible in bringing a balance to the multilateral institution that actually has a lot in stake as far as the peace and stability of the global world is concerned?
Yes, well, we need to understand one thing, is that the Security Council, the UN system of the Security Council specifically, is basically an expression of the international balance of power in the wake of World War II. So basically it represents a moment in time when a few countries emerged out of a redistribution of cards following a conflict which saw traditional European powers wane and other powers basically fill the vacuum. So essentially, we have to agree that with everything in public international law, we're not dealing with a specific objective criteria. But on the contrary, it's all about power politics. Let's make no mistake about it, and let's not delude ourselves into thinking that any kind of reform is going to be somehow adopted because it is just merely in the public interest, i.e. the global public interest. The current organizing and setup of the Security Council will be fought against by those who stand to lose the most from such reform. If anything, owing to the principle that sees the dissolution of power take place when the club of veto-yielding powers is enlarged. When that happens, obviously, the power of at least some of the countries among the 5 permanent members will decrease. It's the same thing that happened when the European Union was enlarged. We saw that the original members of the 6 original members of the EU, which was at the time just a market basically to sell steel, was diluted. And so France and Germany basically saw the influence wane when the EU expanded to the east to include, for the most part, countries from the late Warsaw Pact. So the same thing would happen at the Security Council to the extent we would, for instance, include as permanent members with veto powers countries in, we just look at Africa, Nigeria or South Africa. In South America, Argentina or Brazil. You could not do without India owing to its sheer economic weight and its demographics. And there might be other countries also, likely to have a case that deserves scrutiny, like Japan or who knows, South Korea. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of countries who pretend, also to be, well, Egypt could be also a candidacy that merits scrutiny. So we have to understand those things, and we have to be objective and not naive about the prospect. To the extent the Security Council itself might also have lost a lot of its legitimacy, not least of which out of the result of the lead up to the Iraq War, #2, when we saw that the Security Council might have blocked the United States and its then allies' desire to go to war, when these countries realized that the use of force resolution was sure to be defeated in the Security Council, they still went ahead and organized a kind of a policy, kind of a vengeful band of outlaw nation to proceed and invade a country, on false pretense. I mentioned the Libyan precedent earlier. So the Security Council itself, notwithstanding its membership status and its current configuration, is also suffering from, a decreasing legitimacy. We might instead be looking forward to parallel institutions or complementary institutions. We saw our BRICS suddenly doubled its membership, and it's now somehow coming to be more representative of the current world order as it is in as far as its combined GDP and combined demographics. And, we might at some point down the road be witness to surprising development in as far as the Security Council becoming increasingly obsolete.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
And thank you for that, Arnold. Yulia, it's quite interesting to look at some of these very important aspects and looking at prospects for the reforms of the reform of the UN Security Council. So now, in your capacity as a political consultant, scientist, let's look at. Can you elaborate on how geopolitical dynamics might shift if reforms are actually implemented, particularly regarding Western nations?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question. Could you please repeat?
Could you elaborate on how geopolitical power dynamics might shift if reforms are implemented at the United Nations Security Council, particularly from the side of Western nations?
Well, the UN Security Council at the moment is more a body for discussions. Of course, the opinions that are being voiced at that platform are well heard all over the world, but the problem with the current state of the UN Security Council is that it doesn't have the executive power. So we could already see quite a lot of examples when the decisions of the UN Security Council were either ignored or violated, and nothing really followed. So we see that aside for condemnation of a certain kind, there is no, let's say, executive power, or there is no additional power that can be exercised. Of course, new or let's say some kind of consequences can be discussed, just like sanctions, just like anything else. But with the recent examples, we could see that even sanctions can be imposed regardless of discussions that are held at the UN itself or the UN Security Council. So that's one of the main problems. But of course, for the countries that have been exercising their, let's say, dominance globally, so the collective West, of course, even though from the, let's say, from the realistic perspective, not much would change if more countries are included, because they're still feeling that they're free to do anything outside of the formal and legal framework. At the same time, that could create certain kind of disturbance for implementation of the policies that they carry out, especially when we talk about military operations, and especially when we talk about the self-given rights they have provided themselves in order to change regimes, in order to take out countries' leaders, etc. So there are quite a lot of examples. So in other words, just to put it brief, on the one hand, in real life, not much would change, because the legislation and the rules around the UN Security Council and the UN itself have already compromised themselves, right? And we see that it's no more obligatory to pass sanctions through the UN and the UN Security Council. It's not obligatory anymore to make sure that the UN Security Council agrees for carrying out military operations. But at the same time, of course, the West would not want to see anyone that would not be supportive of their policies, even speaking at the UN and especially at the UN Security Council.
Yeah. About nations speaking at the UN to address internal challenges. Coming to you, Dr. Rashida, we're still looking at the position of the African continent. How does the lack of African representation at the UN Security Council affect the continent's ability to address its own challenges, especially challenges which have, global effects?
Well, thank you so much. Africa has huge number of challenges of internal security, challenges of external conflicting issues that have a direct effect on Africa, and situations where Africa has its own policies of ensuring security within the continent from external incursions and cannot enforce anything at all. It appears Africa is an outsider in the world because critical issues that touch the lives of Africans are often ignored. And so we believe that Africa should be a member of the Security Council and should be able to champion its own affairs, should be able to enforce some key issues that have a direct effect on them. And the fact that you don't belong to the Security Council in a permanent manner also has a feeling that you can be ignored at any one point in time. So those are areas that Africa is looking at. And I think that most importantly, we belong to the General Committee of Nations. We all have a stake in the lives of people of the world. Yeah. We all will have to work towards ensuring the security of our people. And in doing so, we can't depend on the external forces to take care of our lives and to champion our sovereign rights to do what we want to do. So it's important that despite everything, Africa should belong to the world that takes all the decisions about our security. We all have to belong to the United Nations in a general way, trying to enforce the world security, and in which manner we have to be part of the generality of efforts to bring about peace, lasting and sustainable peace in the world. So essentially, it's about involvement, and it's about ensuring that we contribute to the overall security of the world, and to emphasize the fact that external influence in Africa that often creates tension with us can be addressed at that level. We know that sometimes people can speak for Africa, but that's not sufficient. Africans understand themselves much more than anybody understands it. So it's important that we can tell our own story in the midst of every other story that is about the world and about us. So belonging to the national security, the UN Security Council is not a luxury. It must be a choice which is directly linked to the overall security of Africa. It must be addressed in a manner that shows that we are part of the generality of the Committee of Nations. We don't want to be strangers in the world. We don't want to be people who follow the thinking of others. We want our ideas, our thoughts about our own security to be considered directly from us.
Which is very imperative, especially in the present dispensation of the world order, like Arnold Devley mentioned earlier on. Other multilateral institutions actually coming and fitting with the changing dynamics, and it is imperative that every nation of the world be given that position that it can use to address issues which are actually attacking its peace, stability, and even a full transformation. Before continuing with the analysis, let's listen to this excerpt of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres some months ago, actually voicing the need for the reforms, though he said it's going to be a difficult and subtle process, but he at the end underlined the need for reforms at the UN Security Council. I'll join you right after this.
A multipolar world needs strong and effective multilateral institutions. Yet, global governance is stuck in time. Look no further than the United Nations Security Council and the Bretton Woods system. They reflect the political and economic realities of 1945, when many countries in this assembly hall were still under colonial domination. The world has changed. Our institutions have not. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions do not reflect the world as it is. Instead of solving problems, they risk becoming part of the problem.
Instead of solving the problem, they're becoming part of the problem. I want us to bring more emphasis on these words reiterated by the Secretary General of the United Nations Security Council, starting off with you, Julia Berg. Hello, Julia.
Yes, there was some connection issue. Couldn't hear you well.
We just listened to the excerpt of the UN chief, and him reiterating and outlining of that though the world has changed, a lot has changed, but when you look at multilateral institutions, citing the Bretton Woods institutions and even the UN Security Council, you discover that they are still using the preamble of the post-war era. So I would love us to, bring more analysis, understanding on his words and how we can, redefine the prospects for reforms in present-day society.
Yes, one of the good questions I would say that, in my personal opinion, are not discussed wide enough are, let's say, alternative scenarios, because the world right now still finds itself in the paradigm that emanates from the outcomes of the World War II. So in those, let's say, 80 years, we haven't really progressed much as the global community in terms of finding an alternative strategy that would unite and assist to cooperate rather than divide and conquer, right? Because the institutional design that we have at the international arena, some of the specific features of trade and the way the economy is organized, there are still consequences of the World War II. And the dominance of the US to a great extent is based on the fact that during the World War II, they did not really have the military, let's say, theater on their side, yet at the same time they were supplying equipment and they were supplying quite a lot of goods to the Soviet Union, to Europe. And as the result of that, both the Soviet Union and Europe ended up owing a lot to the United States. So that was not aid, but that was loans and lend-lease programs and other similar scenarios that allowed the United States to be the key beneficiary. Not to mention Germany, that was one of the most technologically advanced countries prior to the war, which definitely was one of the key factors that assisted them in, conquering most of Europe at that point. Germany was destroyed. Its technological potential was again taken out by the United States, and we all know about the famous Operation Paperclip that helped them to take out the best scientists, the most advanced technologies and everything else. So this is how the U.S. came about to be at the top of the the global economic system and in terms of the technologies. And we're still living in the consequences, because once it was already at the top, it could dictate the rules, and the Bretton Woods system was also a part of that, let's say, agreement, unformalized agreement, which has allowed the United States to, dictate to a great extent. And when the Soviet Union was still kind of like in power, it was resisting. It was pushing for an alternative platform globally. And so 80 years from then, there is no more Soviet Union at the world map. Yet at the same time, there is still some kind of remains of the bipolar system are still around, and we're still trying to walk forward with our head turned back to the past. So the good question is that could there be an alternative paradigm? And there definitely have been attempts in terms of policies and in the public space to talk about sustainable development and other things as a constructive paradigm, but we still live in that one. And just like Arnaud was mentioning at the very beginning, a very striking example for that is the fact that after the Soviet Union collapsed, it could make more sense to change the objectives of NATO, right? Because the threat that it was built against ceased to exist. Yet at the same time, what we observed is that the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore, and the Russian Federation was introduced as a state that inherited some of the Soviet, let's say, policies and everything else. Still the guns of NATO and the military bases of NATO were turned against Russia. So the paradigm, the post-World War II paradigm didn't go anywhere, and we still look at that when we try to make decisions. The current confrontation, again, is a very striking example of that. Okay. Yet at the same time, the only way to get away from it and to have an alternative focus of attention is to have a constructive platform that would unite alternative forces that are more about global security, that do understand that we're all neighbors, and in the current system of relationships in the world, we cannot ignore any country, and we should consider all of the interests in order to develop the global community. So the paradigm that was out there for several decades is definitely outdated at the moment. Yet an alternative and constructive, let's say, platform or vision is definitely needed to just step out of that matrix.
Right, of course, in bringing more importance to international cooperation, it is imperative to let the voices of every nation across the globe be heard on very pertinent global issues. To you now, Arnaud Davoli, do you share a different perspective pertaining the UN Chief's statement regarding as to why we need a reform in at the United Nations Security Council?
No, on the contrary, I agree wholeheartedly. If the UN does not take stock of the situation and adapt itself accordingly, it will become obsolete. Because the world moves, the world evolves, and things don't stand static. And as he correctly said, you know, if the UN does not adjust its institutional framework, it runs the risk of becoming a relic. And we actually are going through a very watershed moment now, the last 10 months. Let's not forget that the UN Charter's preamble calls to basically circumvent the circumstances that have led to World War II, and is basically making it a prime directive type goal to promote peace and to work toward peace. So it's interesting to see that we may actually have an opportunity, or the UN, as it were, may have an opportunity, maybe not through the Security Council, but through the General Assembly, to effect the changes that are needed so as to wrestle the power away from what has become an unresponsive organ, i.e. the Security Council. And in that respect, I'm alluding to and so let's use correct language here, sure, the plausibility of a genocide being carried out in the Middle East by a nation state that belongs to the UN. In violation of its own obligation per the Convention on the Prohibition of Genocide. So we've had a few decisions, already 4 decisions bearing on conservative measures, which have not been followed up so far on the ground. We also have, let's not forget, a treaty-based organization, the International Criminal Court, which is not a member, an organ of the United Nations per se, but is a treaty creature, a treaty institutional creature, but as such, the treaty is filed at the Secretariat of the United Nations. Therefore, it is an extension of UN body of law, should I say, because it all the jurisprudence of all the ad hoc tribunals, such as the ICCPR, the ICTY, the Special Tribunal on Lebanon, the Extraordinary Chambers in Cambodia, all those decisions, all the jurisprudence that were generated by those ad hoc jurisdictions are basically a body of laws, jurisprudential law upon which the ICC can act. Mm-hmm. And so therefore we are perfectly in the same paradigm here. Okay. And so it would be time for the General Assembly to exercise its powers. Obviously, this requires a lot of lobbying and a lot of wrestling of politicking, in the corridors of the United Nations headquarters. But to the extent a lot of countries are really looking in revulsion as to what's going on, okay, and bearing on the fact that we do have the supreme judicial organ of the United Nations, slowly but surely bearing on the conclusion that one of its member states has violated one of the most fundamental convention, i.e. prohibition of genocide, mm-hmm, which is in and of itself one of the key elements that created the United Nations. Okay. The idea that this would not ever happen again, and that this nation state belongs to this small club of nations that seemingly have appropriated the UN system for their own needs at the expense of everybody else. I would suggest that people representative of all those nation states at the General Assembly pay great care to the recommendation put forward by Dr. Francis Boyle as to the application of Article 22, which allows sanctions and suspensions of rights to be voted on and adopted and effectually put into application, at least at the level of the General Assembly. The Security Council has absolutely no say into what the General Assembly could adopt. Absolutely. And over time, we could use this as a precedent to show that if the Security Council is unable or unwilling to exert the power that was bestowed upon when the Charter was adopted, then the General Assembly could be an alternative form. Obviously, we're not going to be recreating a whole new alternate United Nations. I mean, indeed, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So we need to work with what we have. And if the Security Council is unable to, again, acquit itself of its responsibilities, then the General Assembly has to step up.
Indeed.
And this requires boldness and a lot of lobbying work, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Very imperative indeed, looking at how the multilateral institution can meet the demands of the world in the present context. Coming back to you, Dr. Rashida, we're still looking at some years ago, the African Union became a permanent member of the G20 that was under the presidency of India, and today we are still looking at regional representation. In your own analysis, how should regional organizations, particularly the African Union, we want to bring the African agenda to table at this moment be integrated into the UN Security Council structure to better reflect the geopolitical landscape of Africa in the 21st century. Of course, it is noted that Africa, according to some reports, it's becoming a battle for political contestation in the world of changing alliances. So, you know, how should this regional organization's representation in the UN better reflect the continent's stance on issues of common interest?
Well, thank you so much. If you recall, very early on in 2005, the African Union passed a resolution to request membership of the Security Council. And they are requesting 2 permanent members to have the right of veto coming from Africa. This is in accordance with the Charter of the African Union that requests that the full interest of Africa will be secured in the world if there is permanent representation at the Security Council. Africa has its own security arrangement in the form of the AU Security Council, but it does emphasize that we are aware of the exact results we want. We have specific needs, specific security concerns, and we have passed through situations where the African continent had been violated by people who are now permanent members of the United Nations and enforcing agreements and dealing with issues that do not represent the very interests of Africa. So it's essential that Africa continues in the line of thought that will allow them to have a permanent role in the Security Council, will have a decision in the Security Council to their best interests and to the best interests of their of what makes them stronger, makes them happier, and ensure that there is peace within the continent. So we think that you know, the Charter of the African Union fully describes the essence of security needs of Africa. Situations exist in Africa where extremists can move into the country and destroy part of it. And the only concerns that are expressed about what is happening is often from Africa itself, the country in question. There's no, in several situations, pain had been inflicted in the country, security situations, security rights of the country or integrity of the continent are violated, and by the time anybody would try to get involved, so many people are killed, so much destruction is made, and the dependence of Africa on others is the bane of our ability to unite ourselves and to commit ourselves to a common objective. Mm-hmm. So having a security arrangement which pulls this effort from the generality of the United Nations and giving a strong position in defining what we think is our rights and securing our peace and rights of the world is very important for us. And I think that you know, asking about what we want is a very simple, straightforward answer.
Yeah.
It is just peace we want. It is to be in charge of our own security. It's to own our own decisions to be secured. It's to project ourselves into the generality of the security of the world by participating in it, but starting right from Africa, where we know that we have a direct control of what happens to us. Just imagine a situation where, what happened to Rwanda at the time when the United Nations had secured Rwanda. They immediately had to pull out of the country, and about 1,000 people lost their lives.
Sure.
Think about the situation in Congo when Rwanda, when the Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister, Lumumba, was killed in a very bizarre, intolerable, unacceptable manner. At all these instances, the role of a country, a continent like Africa, to have played a major role in keeping the peace of the people was violated, and there was nobody to speak for Africa. And this situation cannot continue to exist in the midst of the challenging world today, where people can be killed and destroyed, and nobody else can talk for them. It's important for Africa to prepare itself and to ensure that we are able to speak for ourselves, and we are able to defend ourselves. We are able to rely on a world security system which we all contribute to.
Which is very much imperative for Africa to define its own agenda. I'm staying with you, Dr. Rashida. You know, we mentioned earlier on that on the 12th of August 2020, for the Sierra Leone will be leading a conversation that will actually pertain to the African representation at the United Security Council. With the present dispensation of the challenges that happen across the African continent and the position of Africa in the international relations and the changing global times, what do you think can be practically tabled on the part of Africa, which will be represented by Sierra Leone holding the presidency for the month of August, as to how they can position themselves at the UN Security Council to better have a strong voice that will solve some of these problems which you just highlighted earlier on?
The major function of international relations is to defend the interests of the nations in relations. And Sierra Leone is representing the collective interests of Africa. It should emphasize the need for Africa to emphasize their interests. What they call national self-interest must be paramount in this matter. African governments collectively will have a choice to make, that we can take a decision without being influenced from behind. Whether somebody had been your colonial master or not, it is about you. It mustn't be in the interest of another country for Africa to take any decision. And I want to see a situation where, in presenting any ideas, Africa, it must be in the best interest of Africa. Unless in that enterprise, you will have to make negotiations to get to a point where the mutual arrangements that provide the interests of the two countries or two continents, will have to be respected. In no way should Africa present a situation which satisfies somebody else much more than Africa. Sometimes your inability to put in the needed effort to develop the needed capacity has a direct negative interest on the position you hold. But in this matter, Sierra Leone will have to project a view and an interest that surmounts any other views, and must be proven that those interests and views coming from Africa are particularly African, not because they are influenced by any other person, not because somebody has, threatened to withdraw your help or providing you with some help, and in that enterprise, you begin to bend the rule to satisfy them rather than satisfy your collective interest in Africa. So I think that in dealing with this issue, Africa must insist through its representatives to be unique, to be peculiar to its needs, and to insist in not being influenced, to own your policy, foreign policy, and to own the collective interests of your people is very, very crucial in the overall interest of a good international relations. Domestic efforts must be made in such a way that the people we represent must be taken as the key reason we go into any relations. because it must be in their interest. And that interest must be long-lasting, permanent, and not shifted to the admiration or to the desire of another country or continent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashid, just to remind our viewers that this is Global Insight on For You Media Africa, and we're looking at the feasibility of reforming the UN Security Council to meet the contemporary time, that is in the 21st century. Let me come back to you, Arnold Davili. Earlier on you made mention of the role of the United Nations General Assembly. I know in a few weeks to come, leaders of countries will be assembling in New York to actually address some of the challenges affecting the global world at the UN General Assembly 2024. So let's look at these the United Nations Security Council reform being a major, actually a point which countries, especially countries of the global south, can address at the impending UN General Assembly, and how this can, affect regional, maybe relational dynamics pertaining the reforms of the UN Security Council, and how the 5 permanent members of the Council are going to react to this.
Well, somebody made a very interesting point earlier. I think it might have been Julia. Is that basically we're still in the process of decolonization.
Sure.
And this issue is front and center ever since the increasing of tension between what's called the collective West and a resurgent Russian Federation. The UN system as such has now become an arena for those power politics to express themselves. But ever since the start of the special military operation, there's been a change in the atmosphere of international politics. And the aura that used to characterize the collective West has faded drastically, in dramatic fashion. And the global South has, for sure, taken note of that. They feel now themselves emboldened. We've seen tremendous changes. We've discussed those changes in other shows of yours. But in Africa right now, there's a wind of profound change that's going on with a whole new approach to conquering sovereignty, but also consolidating sovereignty and building the foundational elements needed for Africa to chart its own course away from any kind of outside interference. So the world is not waiting for the UN to reform itself. To answer to your question as far as the UN General Assembly is concerned, I think the Global South speakers should all espouse this willingness to promote reform at the level of the General Assembly, as I said. Mm-hmm. This should be an issue that's adopted by consensus, and that every representative of the Global South should basically echo systematically for the time of the event, which is I think about a month. And we should isolate any naysayer and any obstructionist, especially those of the Security Council. We may try to somehow, pull the wool to themselves again, but nobody is duped by their discourse anymore. The world is changing tremendously fast, and they are espousing the same old tired elements of language. It's time to, to be bold in how the Council can be brought to take into account a new reality. And if it doesn't, the General Assembly, again, should take the initiative, take the lead, adopt consensual position on acting in concert on basically making themselves be heard,
okay.
and affecting what happens when some member states do not abide by the core provision of the UN Charter.
Okay. Thank you so much, Arnold Davali. And Julia Burka, we are looking at earlier on, I think it was Arnold Davali that made mention of the expansion of the BRICS. You know, we are looking at reforms of the United Nations Security Council at a time of multipolarity. And of course, BRICS is a veto bloc that is advocating for the philosophy of multipolarity. We are now looking at how the United Nations Security Council can actually learn from new organizations or organizations which are already making reforms to meet the changing times, particularly the BRICS bloc, and how these blocs can influence the United Nations Security Council, and which lessons might be applicable to the UN Security Council in terms of, or in the context of the reforms.
Well, as it looks like at the moment, trying to compare the UN and the BRICS would be same to comparing apples and oranges. So those are completely different things in spirit, right? And completely different things in terms of implementation of policies, because BRICS does not have its own bureaucracy. Yeah. So generally speaking, it's a contact group of heads of states, which is accompanied by contact groups of relevant ministers. And the entire, let's say, philosophy of BRICS or practices of BRICS implies the fact that basically many civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, business organizations appear just like mushrooms after a forest rain. And the strongest and the ones that prove that they're relevant survive. So this is how it functions now, especially after that point in time when dozens of countries applied for membership. The interest to BRICS as as an alliance, it grew tremendously, which made many new organizations appear, and some prove their, let's say, resilience, and some of them operate for many years by now, starting from, let's say, 2015. Yet at the same time, they just implement, let's say, the very same principle of being certain kind of contact groups that do allow for specific projects to be implemented, whether it's related to the academic, let's say, community and research, or whether it's related to cultural, humanitarian, or business-related issues. So it doesn't have any formal structure like the UN does. It doesn't have sub-institutions, which is, let's say, foundations, like the UN does. It doesn't distribute any funding, even though there is the New Development Bank that can serve as an anchor bank for projects also outside of the BRICS, let's say, alliance itself. And those are very different. So we will see how that would be unfolding, because maybe at some point, and that issue is also being discussed, maybe at some point BRICS would also have some kind of an institution or its own bureaucracy. But at the moment, it's just, allowing like all of the flowers to grow, to see which ones survive through the time and through the, crush tests of reality. And what the contact group of heads of states and the relevant ministries do, what they do is they coordinate their efforts. They discuss high-level strategic issues, just like the reform of financial system or introduction of new payment systems, this kind of things. And the reason why BRICS attracts all of that interest is that the key players of the new world are all there. So we have Russia, China, India, and Brazil, South Africa, and now also Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, all those countries that have joined, and those are all strong players. So what strong players decide altogether, of course, is relevant and important for all the other players at this arena. Yet, when you look at the UN, I mean, of course, when you have different countries coming together and their representatives, when you talk about official diplomacy, it implies quite a sophisticated set of rules and procedures. But if you ever look at the way the events at the UN are organized and discussions are organized, if you look at the protocol, or maybe, you know, some of the people in the audience could have participated in those UN role model, let's say, games or UN model games. So the protocol is absolutely what's the correct word I should use here? It's very sophisticated, and so the actual discussion is very much troubled by many procedure rules that do imply. So in order to be speaking at the UN, and in order to be not just, you know, making a speech, but in order to be discussing certain points, you need to go through all of those bureaucratic complications, which definitely does not allow for an effective dialogue at this point, because you cannot just have a discussion that goes back and forth, but the rules, limit the possibilities of participation in this kind of a process. And BRICS is the complete opposite of that. So once again, trying to compare those, it's, you know, like comparing apples and oranges. Yes. And I don't think that one would be able to substitute the other, because the UN was created in order to maintain the status quo and to serve as a body that mediates and negotiates. And also, it is related to distribution of quite a significant amount of funding. And funding, of course, allows to regulate for policy. So when we talk about Africa's role and African countries' role at the UN, I think one of the key issues is that since African countries are recipients of that funding, they should be able to take a very active, play a very active role in distribution of that funding, right? Sure. Whether it's funding that goes for UN peacekeeping missions or whatsoever else, because this is how policies and this is how, you know, big, let's say, areas of life are not just regulated, but in some cases manipulated by the money flow that either goes in or goes out, right? Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think that since it has the direct impact on Africa's security, Africa's healthcare, Africa's infrastructure, and whatsoever else, this is exactly where African countries and their let's say the real promoters of African interest should be working at, not the ones that come from those countries but do not really represent interests of those countries anymore for various reasons. But I think when we look at that, this should be key. And in BRICS, it's regulated by, let's say, the community itself, right? So a lot of different organizations pop up, and some of them prove to be fraudulent, some of them prove to be resilient, and this is how natural selection appears.
Okay. We're almost going to the end, drawing closer to the end of the program. So at this moment, we're looking at recommendations or the possibility of the reforms that will not cause further imbalance in the global world. I will start off with you. Dr. Rashid Pelbois, I think we'll give ourselves just 2 minutes for the conclusions. Hello, Dr. Rashid.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I was very happy to hear the UN General Secretary himself talking about the need for Africa to be represented at the Security Council. Yeah. And he said that he doesn't believe that the 5 permanent members will be opposed to Africa belonging to the UN, in a manner that enables them to be fully represented and effectively participating in the UN process of keeping peace in the world. And for me, this is a key area we can explore. And I already mentioned that Africa had a situation where the African Union, since 2005, had made a request and had passed a resolution to be part of the UN Security Council. Mm-hmm. It is part of the generality of our commitment to ensure balance and fairness in the world. And so Africa belonging to the UN Security Council in a more permanent manner, securing the rights of the people of Africa, I believe is something that can be supported and should be supported by key players in the industry. Except that there is an interest to keep Africa off the system, so the kind of exploitation going on will continue without anybody being able to speak for itself, and the security of the continent is left unchecked and cared for. Nobody can cure for his own security. Nobody else can cure for the security of others, much more than the person themselves or the person himself. So I think that is logical for Africa to call for membership, and I expect that in the not too far future, we will get this happen in the reform of the United Nations, which has been the talk for a very long time now, to create fairness, to create balance, to create involvement, to ensure that the Committee of Nations, where Africa belongs or African countries belong, will have a direct effect on how they think and how they act to secure their peace and to ensure their sovereignty.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Rashid. A concluding phrase from you, Arnold Dovely. 2 minutes, please.
Yes, well, I would echo Dr. Rashid's recommendation as far as the African Union playing a role in representing the African continent on the Security Council. I would add that the European Union should also follow the same model, and France and the UK should basically abandon and fusion their seats, their permanent status, into that representative of the whole Union. Why? Because basically we have a world where now if you're not part of a major ensemble in terms of economic, demographics, and natural wealth, you are a relic of 1945. So the EU should be represented as a bloc. The African Union should represent Africa as a bloc. And I might add that ASEAN could be also an idea to represent East Asia as a bloc. And then we would have China and the US and Russia, because of its sheer size, remain as it is. That would be basically 6 members, all equipped with the veto power. But I would add one little thing, is that in the case of Africa, to the extent we would have an African Union entity representing the interests of the continent, it would have to be an African Union that is not subjected to neo-colonial interference.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. An independent African Union that will chart the course of the African people at the global stage. Let's conclude this phase with you, dear Julia. Recommendations pertaining the reforming of the UN Security Council. Hello, Julia.
So number one recommendation that I would like to bring to the table is that the institutional design and the legal framework around the UN Security Council should function as it's meant to be, right? Because now we don't see that. And that would already make a great change if, the decisions of the UN Security Council are not ignored, but implemented, just like its recommendations. So it's number one. And number two, of course, the membership should be revised in order to reflect the actual situation. So it's a good discussion point to the idea that Arnaud just brought in, that some of the parts of the world could be represented by those regional organizations, yet there is always the threat that inner conflicts would not allow to have a solid position. Yet anyway, it should be revised in order to reflect the actual situation at the global arena where we have major players coming in.
Okay, thank you so much. That intervention from Julia Burke is bringing us to the end of the program. But then I will take this opportunity to say thank you to the panel of experts who are joined this day by Arnaud Dovely, a political consultant, Julia Burke, political scientist, and founder Global Expert Club, and also by Dr. Rashid Pelbo, who is the President of African Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development, also ex-Minister of State Ghana. We want to appreciate your great insider patterning the stakes around surrounding the reforming of the United Nations Security Council. We want to appreciate the technicians also for ensuring that it was a smooth program. Thanking you most especially, ladies and gentlemen, for trusting the Pan-African television and always have in mind that it is another view of the world. Wait for you, Media Africa, and I wish you a wonderful moment. And you stay in the company of programs on For You Media Africa. Bye-bye.